60s, many artists incorporated the sonic signifiers of the distant past, such as harpsichord ostinatos, string quartets, and contrapuntal techniques, into the modern soundscapes of rock, creating the subgenre of Baroque rock. While artists sonically referenced Baroque instrumentation and style in order to evoke associations with respectability, the parental generation, and/or the all-encompassing past, they also used music from the distant past to accompany lyrical expressions of nostalgia for their relatively recent childhood. In Arrested Development, Pop Culture and the Erosion of Adulthood, Andrew Calkett argues that those who participated in the countercultural sensibility of the 1950s and 60s were not only socially and chronologically pre-adult, but furthermore, they subverted the previously accepted structuring of the human life cycle by refusing to grow up. The lack of faith in existing society laid the groundwork for people who refused to accept the norms associated with adulthood and thus retreated into images of childhood in an attempt to avoid questions of humanity's future. This retreat manifested in various ways, such as the Back to the Land movement, the inception of Renaissance fairs, retro chic fashion, and in popular music. In 1967, William Mann argued, quote, "It has been a period of nursery lyrics. The Lennon-McCartney Yellow Submarine set the ball rolling, and of late we have had no end of songs whose words bring out the delayed adolescence in all of us," unquote. Psychedelic drugs, among other hallucinogens, not only increase awareness and consciousness, but also sentimentality and sensitivity, which accounts for nostalgia's relationship with the psychedelic experience and artists' decisions to write about their childhood. Drug consumption's effect on awareness is detailed in Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. Under the influence of mescaline, Huxley admitted a, quote, "complete indifference to time," unquote, in which he perceived an abundance of time without regard for an exact duration, resulting in a feeling of a perpetual present. Viewing history as a perpetual present is a revolutionary ideal because bringing the past out of the continuum of history and into the present disavows a linear progression of time, allowing reconstructions of the past to be utilized to make statements about contemporary society. While William Mann refers to the phenomenon of musically referencing the distant past as both escapist and aligning with the camp trend in fashion and art, George Melly argues that the word pop in the 1960s was interchangeable with the word camp in relation to, quote, "an irreverent revival of certain humble or popular objects from the past, and by wrenching these objects out of their historical context, they are rendered harmless," unquote. What might appear as an escapist retreat into childhood or eclectic nostalgia is actually a method of rejecting the past. As such, I introduced the term postmodern nostalgia to refer to a symptom of crisis and progress that is simultaneously reflexive in its detached interpretation of history and imagined in its participants' ability to reference a past they have not experienced. As previously mentioned, rock artists primarily used music from the Baroque period, which is an unexperienced past, to represent and refer to a past that they had experienced, such as their childhoods. This musical choice is ironic because lyrics of sentimentality toward the past are paired with detached, strict Baroque counterpoint rather than smooth, flowing melodic lines with simple accompaniment, creating a cognitive dissonance between what is said, in this case the lyrics' sentimentality for the recent past, and how this concept is delivered, which is the music's detachment recalling the distant past. The ironic anachronism allows this dissonance to alert the listener to constructions of memory and the perception of time. As such, postmodern nostalgia utilizes the past in order to comment on the present with a desire to progress into a society that questions its surroundings rather than accepts categorical distinction as fact. Media studies scholar John Potts suggests that both progress and nostalgia require a, quote, "abdication of memory," in that the past is represented as other, backward, superficially appealing, but ultimately undesirable, unquote. Progress occurs when one recognizes that the past is not always better than the present, and when one questions nostalgia's rose-tinted view of the world and its dismissal of unpleasant memories. Therefore, rather than view Baroque rock's anachronism as an expression of sentimentality or a nostalgic desire to retreat into the past. I interpret it as a sonic representation of the struggle between adolescence and adulthood. Emerging adulthood is a psychological theory first proposed by Jeffrey Arnett to describe the phase of life between adolescence and full-fledged adulthood. Arnett argues that those experiencing emerging adulthood in their late teens through their mid to late 20s, quote, struggle with uncertainty, even as they revel in being freer than they ever were in childhood or ever will be once they take on the full weight of adult responsibilities, unquote. This phase in life can be interpreted as a purgatory between youth's instability and adulthood's stability, which results in an anxious desire for both. Arnett argues that emerging adults often look back wistfully on the past, not necessarily because it was better, but because in retrospect, life was more stable and structured. While emerging adulthood and the term quarter-life crisis have come into common parlance to explain delayed adulthood in the millennial generation, the identity crisis it describes is not new. The struggle between adolescence and adulthood has been portrayed in popular films, such as The Graduate and St. Elmo's Fire, as well as popular songs, such as The Beach Boys' When I Grow Up, The Beatles' Help, and Fleetwood Mac's Landslide, to name just a few. At age 24, John Lennon wrote the title track for the Beatles' new album and film, appropriately titled Help. 24 years is reflective age when nostalgia for a carefree childhood juxtaposes with current adult responsibilities and thus an internal conflict of how to proceed. The song begins with a plea for assistance as Lennon confesses that his life changed and he no longer has the self-assurance and independence he once enjoyed in his youth. The song was written about the stress that came with the Beatles' rapid rise to fame, but the lyrics also address the paradox of independence experienced during emerging adulthood. Adults are expected to be independent, but emerging adults do not necessarily feel equipped to deal with this lack of support, thus depending on others to help them reach a certain level of independence. 3 months later, the Beatles released In My Life, in which John meditates on his past, yet celebrates his lover's present immediacy, accompanied by a simulated harpsichord solo in the bridge. While the juxtaposition of Baroque musical elements from the distant past with nostalgic lyrics about a recent childhood can be interpreted as mocking the nostalgia for an imagined past, it can also be interpreted as representing the disconnect between childhood innocence and the responsibilities experienced during emerging adulthood, as well as reclaiming an aspect of an artist's youth that was lost due to reaching high levels of fame at an early age. While the Beatles' In My Life is often credited for starting the Baroque rock trend, the Beach Boys' When I Grow Up, from 1964, was one of the first rock songs to feature a harpsichord, before the Beatles began experimenting with instrumentation outside of the traditional rock setting. And it was one of the first rock songs to address the subject of emerging adulthood. The harpsichord's association with seriousness while playing rock riffs fit aptly within a song that questioned adulthood from a child's point of view. The Beach Boys of Southern California are often left out of conversations about Baroque rock because they are primarily known as a surf rock group. Their career was founded on songs about young men's preoccupations with surf, sand, automobiles, and bikini-clad girls before they transitioned into more fully orchestrated songs about adulthood. Brian Wilson's new sound was designed to break away from the lush sounds of sentimental pop music, which was usually accompanied by strings performing in a legato, lugubrious classical style, as opposed to the detached, syncopated, and sharp sound of Baroque rock. Rather than simply reverting back to childlike wonders, the Beach Boys began experimenting with new sounds on a song about the sadness of childhood's brevity and the power of adulthood to change an individual's outlook on life. When I Grow Up begins with the group singing a dissonant, functionally ambiguous chord accompanied by a harpsichord performing the song's main riff. This opening chord represents the uncertainty of the narrator's perspective, as well as the narrative tension between Brian Wilson's age of 23 and the narrator's age of 13. Alice Boleyn of Pop Matters argues that the song is about, quote, a 23-year-old who imagined a 13-year-old imagining what it was like to be 23, unquote. And as such, the song is written from the perspective of an adolescent who ponders what changes are ahead as he transitions into adulthood. The lyrics are written in the form of questions associated with emerging adulthood anxieties, such as regret, settling down, marriage, and parenthood, all of which remain unanswered. In the first verse, the narrator's question about whether or not he will still dig those sounds when he grows up is musically represented through the blending of the band's old and new styles. The Beach Boys' childhood musical influences are represented in their 4 freshman-like vocal harmonies and surf-style rhythm guitar for which they gained notoriety, while the harpsichord and harmonica represent an aesthetic change associated with the maturation and foreshadow the sonic experimentation later featured in their Pet Sounds album. The harpsichord musically represents the narrator's reflection on the transition from youth to adulthood, as the instrument is associated with the past, yet simultaneously functions as a sonic novelty in rock.
When I grow up to be a man, will I dig the same things that turned me on as a kid? Will I look back and say that I wish I hadn't done what I did? Will I joke around, still joke around, and still dig those signs, still dig the signs? Will I grow up to be a man?
Each subsequent verse represents a different point in the traditional life cycle and is accompanied by a call and response between the lead singer's questions and the backing vocalist's recitation of corresponding ages. In the last chorus, the group leads into a climax with a brief pause of anticipation after the lyrics, "What will I be?" before returning to the resolution of the song's title. The harpsichord further resolves the chord with the familiar riff, creating a brief false ending before a drum fill initiates an outro featuring the continued recitation of ages from 22 to 32. These ages are interrupted by Wilson and Love alternating between the lyrics, "It won't last forever," and "It's kind of sad," before the song fades out, further representing the inability to stop time and the continuous presence of these anxieties throughout adulthood.
What will I be? Will I grow up to be a man? 22, 23, won't last forever. 24, 25, 26, 27, won't last forever. 28, 29, 30, 31.
While all youth develop within the context of emerging adulthood, how, when, and even if they experience it is determined more by sociological factors such as race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, class, etc., than by numerical age. Emerging adulthood has also been described as, quote, "a luxury only available to those with sufficient means," unquote. Therefore, the privileges typically afforded to young white men allow this population more so than others to ruminate on the past and ponder philosophical questions about life. Even if rock artists were raised in working-class families and neighborhoods, they began to write about emerging adulthood after they reached a certain level of success, presumably because fame caused their lives to change simultaneously with their transition into adulthood. Research findings suggest that while young women have constructed their own identity narrative by the age of 20, this age is when young men begin asking questions regarding, quote, who they are, how past experiences have shaped their current identity, and who they intend to be in the future, unquote. Even though Judy Collins was the first to record the song Both Sides Now, the song was originally written by Joni Mitchell when she was 23 years old. Mitchell's composition was influenced by a particular passage in Saul Bellows' novel Henderson the Rain King, in which the title character looks down from an aircraft window and reflects, quote, "I dreamed down at the clouds and thought that when I was a kid I had dreamed up at them, and having dreamed at the clouds from both sides, as no other generation of men has done, one should be able to accept his death very easily," unquote. In addition to this passage, which highlights alternative perspectives, Mitchell was undoubtedly influenced by her own life experiences as she penned the lyrics. Sheila Weller argues that the song's themes of, quote, thoughtful indecisiveness and the shifting, illusory nature of truth, unquote, suggests an autobiographical connection to Mitchell's traumatic decision to place her baby daughter for adoption in 1965. In a later interview in 2012, Mitchell revealed that the song, quote, was triggered by a broken heart, the loss of my child. In this 3-year period of childhood's end, I'd come through such a rough, tormented period as a destitute, unwed mother. I had some serious battles for a 21-year-old, unquote. At such a young age, Mitchell not only mourned the loss of her own childhood innocence, but also the loss of her own child. Both Sides Now demonstrates that the view of nostalgia and emerging adulthood from the perspective of a woman is one grounded in realism and acceptance rather than a whimsical, unfulfilled desire to return to the past. Judy Collins' version of Both Sides Now was featured on her first entirely orchestral album, Wildflowers. Her previous album, In My Life, included arrangements by Joshua Rifkin, who wrote more orchestral arrangements on that album than on her previous albums, which featured a more straightforward folk style. Rifkin created the string arrangement and performed the arpeggiated harpsichord part on Both Sides Now, which blended these Baroque sounds with the folk pop style found in college coffee houses. Once the song was released as a single in October of 1968, it reached the number 8 position on the US Billboard Hot 100. Both Sides Now opens with Rifkin performing descending and ascending arpeggios on a jangly sounding harpsichord, which simulates the sound of a child's music box. Not only is the listener transported back to the sounds of their own childhood, but these sequential arpeggios also sonically foreshadow the emotional ebb and flow of emerging adulthood anxieties to come. Each verse features subjects such as clouds, love, and life, which are presented as unknowable illusions that are perceived differently with age. The lyrics of each verse describe this shift of perspective from childhood's naive optimism to adulthood's realistic pessimism. For example, childlike perceptions of clouds as angel hair, ice cream castles, and feathered canyons give way to the adult realization that clouds cause precipitation and block the sun. The musical accompaniment highlights the tension between the perceptions of her past childhood and present adulthood. The harpsichord switches to held chords when Collins sings about looking at clouds, love, and life from both sides, in this case, from both the perspective of a child and an adult. Collins's return to a state of recollection is accompanied by a return to sequential arpeggios before the harpsichord stops suddenly and switches to a repeated figure when she admits that she does not know the subjects at all. The arpeggiated riff signals the past with its constant optimism, while the present is represented by silence or held chords, indicating a realization or altered perception.
Goes and flows of angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feathered canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way, but now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow it's clouds' illusions I recall. I really don't know clouds at all.
And rising harpsichord riff connotes a dreamlike state representative of the desire to preserve childlike wonder and imagination, as well as the illusionary nature of clouds, love, and life that distort perceptions of reality. The beginning of each verse represents nostalgia for childhood, while subsequent verses end with regret, followed by shielded emotions, and finally acceptance. The song progresses from mourning a loss of innocence to accepting that each experience of loss has led to wisdom, even if that wisdom comes in the form of admitting ignorance, such as the lyrics, "I really don't know life at all." In her composition, Joni Mitchell not only realizes that age and experience offer new perspectives, but she also recognizes their limits when confronted with life's unanswered questions. This acceptance of change and the ability to admit she is still growing, particularly after a traumatic experience, is what sets her experience of emerging adulthood apart from those expressed by the Beach Boys. Thank you all so much.